And although you kind of know that this might happen, you don't really think about it very much.
The table had been prepared for a family conversation that was never meant to leave Windsor. King Charles expected disagreement, perhaps even resistance, but he did not expect the most dependable person in his family to refuse to walk through the door. When Princess Anne rejected his invitation to a private coronation planning dinner, her empty chair became more powerful than any speech, and the king's devastated reaction revealed that this was no ordinary scheduling dispute. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles arranged the evening secretly. He wanted the family at Windsor Castle, away from cameras, so the coronation decisions could be settled. The coronation was the ceremony in which a monarch was crowned and confirmed, but this dinner concerned far more. It would decide family roles, ceremonial precedence, the official order showing who stood where security duties, and the image the monarchy would present. Then the refusal arrived. An equerry, the royal officer who assists the sovereign, silently entered the sitting room and placed a sealed note beside Charles's untouched tea. The king broke the envelope and read Anne's handwriting twice. She would not attend. She could not support decisions made before the family had been properly consulted. No anger crossed his face. That made the moment worse. He lowered himself into a chair and stared at the page, as though one message had removed the certainty beneath him. Anne had disagreed with her brother before, but she had always appeared when duty demanded it. She stood beside him through scrutiny and family fracture. Now she was refusing not only a meal, but the appearance of approval. Charles felt the distinction, and the wound cut deeper because it came from the sibling whose loyalty he never thought he needed to question. Camilla watched him fold the note with unsteady care. She understood that Anne was challenging more than a seating plan. The Princess Royal was questioning how authority moved around the king, who was heard and who was shut outside before decisions were declared final. Still, Charles ordered Anne's place to remain set. He believed she might walk in before the first course. William received the news but did not telephone his aunt. His silence suggested that he already understood what had driven her away. Then, an aide spoke quietly. Anne's letter contained a final sentence Charles had not shown Camilla. Those words threatened to turn an empty chair into a confrontation over the crown itself. Charles could endure her absence, but he could not ignore the possibility that his sister did not trust the people shaping his reign. Long before crowns, ceremonies, and guarded palace doors divided their lives, Charles and Anne understood one another through duty. She was the sister who rarely comforted him with soft words, but repeatedly stood beside him when others stepped back. That history made her refusal almost unbearable. To the king, the missing dinner was not simply a political protest. It felt like the withdrawal of a loyalty he had believed could never be exhausted. Charles carried the weight of more than one evening. He wanted the coronation to protect tradition, while presenting a modern royal household, but every decision now passed through advisors before reaching him. The coronation was the formal ceremony that confirmed and crowned the monarch, yet the planning around it also decided who would stand closest to power, who would be seen as essential, and whose role would quietly be reduced. That made every change deeply personal. Anne understood that danger better than most. As the Princess Royal, the title traditionally given to the sovereign's eldest daughter, she had spent decades placing duty above comfort. She trusted procedure, because procedure protected the monarchy from favor, pressure, and private influence. Popularity meant little to her. Stability meant everything. Earlier that afternoon, Anne stood alone with the invitation in her hand. She reached for a pen, paused over the acceptance line, then slowly turned the card over. Her refusal was written by hand because she wanted Charles to know the words were hers. No advisor had shaped them, no courtier had softened them. She knew the message would wound him, but attending would suggest approval of decisions she believed had become dangerously personal. Charles felt that wound immediately. He had expected Anne to protect him from division, not deepen it. His sadness became disbelief. Why had she chosen absence instead of direct counsel? Why had the one person who always faced difficulty beside him decided that an empty chair would speak more strongly than her presence? William searched for the answer before anyone else dared ask. In a private conversation, he questioned Anne's senior aide and asked whether she was angry with the king. The reply came without hesitation. She was not angry, she was disappointed. That word carried more force than accusation, because disappointment meant trust had already been damaged. Camilla suspected the refusal was tied to proposed changes in the coronation procession, the official order in which royal figures would enter and appear. She feared Anne objected to the prominence being given to certain extended family members. But the real concern went deeper. Anne believed one ceremonial decision could weaken William's position and blur the constitutional line of succession, the legal order determining who inherits the throne. The invitation had not caused the break. Days earlier, during a closed rehearsal, Anne had witnessed one decision that changed everything. To understand why she stayed away, Windsor had to return to the moment she realized the dinner would not be a discussion. It would be an endorsement. The refusal at Windsor had been written in silence, but it was born during a confrontation no one present could forget. Inside St. George's Hall, beneath the language of ceremony and tradition, one alteration changed the atmosphere instantly. Anne saw a revised coronation order placed before the family and recognized that a private preference had been transformed into royal protocol. When Charles dismissed her warning with a single sentence, the sister who had defended him for decades reached her point of no return. Charles entered the closed rehearsal already under pressure. Camilla sat beside him. William remained watchful, and Anne studied the papers placed before them. The briefing was meant to settle movements, seating, family entrances, procession order, and the responsibilities of senior working royals. A coronation rehearsal briefing was simply the private planning session used to organize how the ceremony would unfold, but every position carried meaning. Who entered first, who stood closest, and who appeared beside the sovereign, all signaled rank, trust, and future power. Then the revised plan appeared. Anne read it once and immediately understood the change. Camilla's relatives had been given a more prominent arrival sequence, while William and the Princess Royal were expected to accept the alteration without a full family consultation. The procession order, the official sequence in which royal figures entered and appeared, was not a decorative detail. It told the public who belonged at the center of the monarchy and who stood outside it. Anne slid the document back across the table. She asked Charles whether the change had come from the official committee or from a private request made after the earlier version had already been approved. The king looked exhausted. He told his sister the decision was settled and asked her not to turn every adjustment into a constitutional struggle. That sentence cut deeper than he realized. Anne removed her glasses, closed the folder, and held his gaze. She did not raise her voice. She told him that loyalty could not require silence when the institution itself was being placed at risk. Charles stiffened, convinced she was challenging his authority. She felt something colder, the shock of being dismissed by the brother she had defended for decades. William watched them both. He wanted to protect his father, yet he could see that Anne's objection was procedural, not personal. Camilla remained quiet, but the silence carried its own weight. Anne noticed that the queen consort already held the newest version of the plan before several senior officials had even received it. Later, Anne learned the truth. The private dinner had not been arranged to reconsider the changes. It was designed to secure family unity around decisions already made. She was not being invited to influence the outcome. She was being asked to endorse it. That was when Anne made her choice. Her only remaining power was absence. But Charles was not prepared to accept silence as her final answer, and before the dinner began, he ordered that his sister be contacted directly. Charles had spent his life surrounded by people trained to soften rejection. Anne had never been one of them. When the king telephoned her personally and demanded that she explain the refusal directly, neither sibling hid behind titles, courtiers, or carefully prepared language. The conversation began with an invitation to reconsider. It ended with a sentence so painful that Charles removed the telephone from his ear and stared at it in stunned silence. Charles dismissed 2 aides only minutes before the dinner was due to begin. He wanted no secretary shaping his words and no courtier negotiating between them. A courtier was a member of the royal household who served and advised the sovereign, but at that moment the king wanted none of them near him. He closed the door, lifted the telephone, and called his sister himself. Anne answered from her Windsor residence, already dressed for another engagement. Her calm voice made the truth impossible to avoid. She had not forgotten the dinner. She had not been delayed. Her absence was deliberate. Charles asked her to come to the castle and say it to his face. If she truly would not stand beside him, he wanted to hear the words directly. Anne did not hesitate. She told him that she had stood beside him through scandal, grief, and public pressure. but she would not sit at a table where honest objections were treated as disloyalty. The king's anger broke through. He accused his sister of humiliating him at the most vulnerable stage of coronation planning. His voice tightened, then cracked, when he asked why she had chosen this moment to withdraw. Anne answered that she was not withdrawing. She was warning him. Her fear was simple and dangerous. People close to Charles were beginning to confuse personal access with constitutional authority. Constitutional authority meant the lawful power attached to the crown and its official roles, not influence gained through private relationships. Anne believed that line was being blurred, and she refused to pretend otherwise. Charles gripped the edge of his desk as she spoke. Then Anne delivered the sentence he could not bear to hear. "You asked for my presence, not my judgment." He slowly lowered the telephone before the call had formally ended. Camilla entered moments later and found him standing in silence. The queen consort asked what Anne had said, but he could not repeat it. He only stared ahead, wounded by words he knew contained truth. Then the conflict deepened. Anne had sent a confidential memorandum, a private written statement setting out her concerns to William. She had ensured the warning could not remain a family argument hidden behind closed doors. William arrived at Windsor carrying that document. He refused to condemn his aunt. Instead, he told Charles that the true danger was not Anne's absence. It was the reason she believed absence was necessary. Anne had rejected the king's table, but the balance of power now rested with William. His response would decide whether Charles faced one dissenting sister or a united challenge from the future of the monarchy. Everyone expected William to make a choice. He could defend his father and condemn Anne's refusal, or he could support his aunt and deepen the king's humiliation. Instead, the prince did something more dangerous. He refused to treat the crisis as a family quarrel. By asking one carefully worded question about who had approved the revised plans, William shifted the balance inside Windsor and forced Charles to examine how much control he truly possessed. William entered the unfinished dinner gathering without ceremony. Anne's refusal was already known to the small circle around the table, and the silence told him more than any briefing could. As heir to the throne, he understood that ceremonial precedence, the official order showing who appears before whom, was never just about seating or entrances. It signaled rank, continuity, and the future shape of the monarchy. William placed Anne's memorandum on the table, but did not slide it toward his father. He simply asked who had authorized the final changes and why the heir had not been consulted before the revised version was circulated. The prince kept his voice calm, but the question struck like an accusation. Charles heard betrayal where William intended caution. The king reminded him that the coronation belonged to the sovereign, not to a committee of relatives. He believed his son should have defended him first and questioned him later. The monarch's pain was no longer hidden. Anne had refused him, and now William appeared to be standing behind her. William chose every word carefully. He told Charles that loyalty to the sovereign also meant preventing private tensions from becoming public constitutional confusion. Constitutional confusion meant uncertainty about who held lawful authority and how royal roles should be understood. If the planning process looked compromised, the damage would reach far beyond one dinner. Camilla sat rigidly beside the king. She felt the discussion turning into an examination of her influence. The queen consort asked whether Anne's absence was being used to weaken her position. William did not accuse her, but he refused to dismiss the concern. Then the private secretary spoke. The senior official admitted that several alterations had entered the plan after informal discussions outside the main committee. A private secretary was a senior aide responsible for managing royal business and communication. Yet this admission revealed that the official process had been bypassed. Charles finally saw the gap. The changes had been presented to him as minor adjustments needing approval. Anne had seen something more serious, a system allowing personal access to shape public ceremony. Anne could not command the coronation, but she controlled her presence, her reputation, and the moral weight of her refusal. That gave William the leverage to demand a proper review without openly defying his father. Charles agreed to open the planning records, but the decision came too late to contain the damage. The dinner had not merely failed. It had exposed a chain of decisions he could no longer defend without understanding. And as the files were opened, everyone inside Windsor began preparing for the fallout. The candles were lit, the doors were closed, and the food had already been prepared. But the gathering at Windsor no longer resembled the united family dinner Charles had imagined. Anne's chair remained empty. William barely touched his glass. Camilla spoke only when necessary. At the center of it all sat the king, watching a carefully planned evening disintegrate around him while servants quietly removed courses no one had the appetite to finish. Charles allowed the dinner to continue because canceling it would confirm that Anne's refusal had paralyzed the household. Only a handful of people remained, and each understood the original purpose had already failed. The evening was meant to display family unity around the coronation plan. Instead, it exposed the fracture that unity had been designed to hide. Charles finally looked toward Anne's untouched place setting and ordered a footman to remove the chair. A footman was a senior household servant responsible for formal duties at royal events, but even he hesitated before obeying. Halfway across the room, the king changed his mind. He told the servant to leave it where it was. That reversal revealed everything. Charles was furious with his sister, yet he could not erase her place without admitting that the bond between them had broken. The empty chair wounded him, but removing it felt worse. It would turn anger into separation. Camilla felt the accusation settling around her. She believed the dispute had been exaggerated, yet every silence seemed to point toward her influence. After the dinner, the queen consort asked Charles whether he thought Anne's warning was true. The king did not answer. His hesitation frightened her more than denial would have. Camilla closed the door behind them, removed a bracelet, and placed it sharply on the dressing table. She admitted that Anne's refusal had made every coronation decision involving her family appear suspicious. The monarch listened, but his silence remained heavy. He was no longer certain which choices had been his, and which had reached him already shaped. William left the dining room without satisfaction. He told an aide that Charles had looked less like an angry sovereign than a brother who believed he had lost his sister. The prince understood that winning an argument would mean nothing if the family collapsed around it. Then the records delivered the most damaging truth. Anne had raised her concerns in writing before the rehearsal, but her full memorandum had never reached Charles. Someone inside the royal household had condensed the warning into a routine note, stripping away its urgency and leaving the king unaware of how strongly she objected. When Anne learned what had happened, her anger changed direction. She no longer saw only a brother who had ignored her. She saw a monarch who had been shielded from the truth. That discovery changed everything. Anne agreed to return to Windsor, but only under one condition. She would speak to Charles completely alone. For the first time, the crisis was no longer about who had refused the dinner. It was about what had been kept from the king and whether brother and sister could still speak without anyone shaping the truth between them. There were no advisors in the room, no ceremonial papers, no queen consort, no heir, and no private secretary waiting to translate what either sibling meant. When Anne returned to Windsor, Charles met her not as the sovereign demanding obedience, but as the brother who had spent a sleepless night wondering whether their bond had finally broken. What followed was not an apology in the traditional sense. It was something rarer inside a palace, an honest conversation without protection. Anne arrived the following morning and made her condition clear. She wanted no aides, no recording devices, no prepared statements, and no formal minutes. Formal minutes were the official written record of what was said and decided in a royal meeting, but she did not want this conversation preserved by anyone except the two people living through it. Charles agreed because the discovery that her original warning had been withheld had shaken his trust in the people managing information around him. Anne entered, closed the door herself, and remained standing. Charles asked whether she had come to defend the refusal or repair what it had damaged. The question carried more pain than anger. Anne answered without hesitation. She admitted that she knew the empty chair would wound him. She had understood exactly what her absence would mean to a brother who had always counted on her presence. But she believed attending would have hidden a deeper problem. It would have allowed private influence to appear as family agreement. Charles finally said what he had not been able to admit before. He experienced her refusal as abandonment. He thought she was telling him that she no longer trusted his judgment as monarch or brother. The king had faced criticism from the public, the press, and members of his own household. But Anne's rejection struck differently, because it came from the person whose loyalty had always felt permanent. Anne sat opposite him and chose her words carefully. She told Charles that she trusted his intention, but she no longer trusted every person acting in his name. The distinction changed the room. He had believed she was accusing him of weakness. Instead, she was warning him that others were using his authority without giving him the full truth. Charles softened. He acknowledged that Anne should have been given a genuine consultation, not an invitation to approve settled decisions. She made clear that she wanted no control over the coronation, and no greater place for herself. Her concern was the process, William's constitutional role, and the danger of informal influence reshaping public ceremony. Charles reached for the revised plan and drew a firm line through the disputed changes. He ordered a new review involving the official committee and the senior working royals. The decision did not erase the hurt, but it gave the hurt meaning. Anne rose to leave. Charles stopped her and asked whether she would stay for tea. They did not embrace, yet she sat down again. Inside Windsor, brother and sister had found a path back to one another, but beyond the castle walls, Anne's empty chair was about to become the image through which the world judged the monarchy. The palace had hoped the refusal would remain private. Instead, one image came to define the crisis. A long Windsor dining table, a place setting left untouched, and a chair positioned beneath the light, with no one sitting in it. By morning, the photograph had become a symbol of resistance, heartbreak, and royal division. The public did not merely ask why Anne stayed away. They demanded to know what could make duty's most reliable servant finally say no. Palace staff had been seen leaving Windsor unusually late, and whispers moved faster than any official explanation. The household first described the gathering as a private planning meeting, meaning a closed discussion about the coronation rather than a public royal event. But once Anne's absence became known, that explanation could no longer contain the story. Her empty chair had already said too much. A national newspaper seized the moment. Its front page carried the photograph of the untouched place beneath the headline, "The Chair That Challenged a King." The image reduced a complicated dispute to one unforgettable symbol. Charles appeared wounded. Anne appeared defiant. The monarchy appeared divided. Outside Windsor Castle, a royal correspondent delivered the morning broadcast live. The journalist called the incident the most personal test of Charles's authority since he became sovereign. Sovereign meant the reigning monarch who held the crown's formal authority, but the broadcaster's point was painfully human. This was not simply a challenge to the king. It was a rejection from his own sister. Visitors gathered near the Long Walk, the ceremonial avenue leading toward the castle. One woman pressed a handwritten card against the barrier. It read, "Duty also means telling the truth." Others disagreed. Some believed Anne had humiliated her brother at the worst possible moment. Others argued that she had protected the institution when private loyalty demanded too much silence. Charles watched the coverage alone. He heard commentators suggest that he had lost control of his family, and the words unsettled him more than he expected. Before the segment ended, the king switched off the television. The gesture was small, but it revealed how deeply the story had reached him. Anne saw the same newspaper and refused to celebrate. She told an aide in a private conversation that her goal had never been to weaken Charles. She wanted him to understand what was being done around him before those choices became permanent. The palace finally issued a short statement. It confirmed that coronation arrangements were being reviewed through the proper channels, and that Anne would continue performing her official duties. The message calmed the noise, but it did not settle the meaning of the refusal. Only one act could do that. The public had judged the empty chair, but the final verdict belonged to Charles, and to the decision he would make when the family gathered again. Anne never withdrew her refusal. Charles never pretended it had not wounded him. Yet the crisis ended not with one sibling defeating the other, but with both accepting a truth the monarchy often struggles to admit. Loyalty without honesty is merely obedience. When the revised coronation plan was finally presented, the disputed privileges were gone. The constitutional order was restored, and Anne stood beside her brother, not because she had surrendered, but because Charles had finally listened. Charles arranged a second planning meeting at Windsor under a structure no one could quietly alter. Every decision would be recorded, every participant formally authorized, and no private change could enter the process without review. The constitutional order meant the lawful hierarchy and responsibilities that kept the monarchy stable. This time, nothing would be shaped in secret. Anne agreed to attend the official meeting, but she refused a new invitation to recreate the original dinner. Her answer was calm and final. She would return for duty, not to pretend the wound had never happened. Charles entered carrying the revised plan himself. Before anyone spoke, the king placed a copy in front of his sister and told the room that her objections had not been disloyal. They had been necessary. The admission cost him pride, but it restored something more valuable: trust. Anne did not smile in victory. She thanked her brother, opened the folder, and immediately began discussing responsibilities. The Princess Royal made no demand for greater prominence, because the dispute had never been about her place. It had been about protecting the process. Camilla then accepted an uncomfortable truth. Informal family requests could not be allowed to reshape constitutional ceremony. The Queen Consort's admission prevented resentment from remaining hidden, and made clear that personal access would no longer outweigh official procedure. William watched his father restore order. The prince understood that Charles had not weakened royal authority by accepting correction. He had protected it. A sovereign who refused all challenge could become isolated, but a monarch willing to hear difficult truth could still lead. The revised arrangements moved forward. William's position was clarified, Anne's duties were formally confirmed, and every disputed addition disappeared from the ceremonial sequence. Charles remained saddened that his sister had felt forced to refuse him, but he no longer saw the empty chair as abandonment. He understood it as the only warning powerful enough to reach him. Anne's decision carried its own verdict. Duty was not measured by how often a royal said yes. Sometimes service meant accepting blame to prevent deeper damage. After the meeting, Charles and Anne walked out together. At the doorway, he touched her arm and told her that next time, she must come directly to him. She replied that next time, he must make certain the door remained open. And so the empty chair at Windsor was remembered not as the place where a family finally broke, but as the place where one sister's refusal compelled a king to listen and allowed both the crown and their bond to survive. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.